question was number 2. It states the outbreak of war in 1914 postponed the downfall of Nicholas II, but also contributed to his overthrow in the first 1917 Russian Revolution. To what extent do you agree with this statement? All right, I outlined how my presentation focusing on how Tsar Nicholas was in 1914 and compared it to how he was in 1917. In the beginning, 1914 was the outbreak of the First World War I, as we all know. And since Russia was still recovering from bad agriculture and starving peasants, and like the whole country was still a mess, and they still wanted to modernize, but with everything going on, they didn't really have time to develop it as they really wanted to. And in the war, France and Russia were allies. And the results, in the beginning, it was really helpful because everybody was like, oh, well, Tsar Nicholas is actually being patriotic, fighting for country and stuff. And the results, economically, peasants still weren't receiving the food and the materials that they need to survive, but they really didn't care because during the war they kind of understand to some extent, but their jobs weren't really paying that much, and they had long hours but shorter pay. The military situations basically developed that men were going to the front line but not returning home, and that ran into the country stressing. Tsar Nicholas was getting kind of irritated about how everybody kept complaining to him, saying, oh, people's not returning, the country's a mess, what are you going to do about it, because he is like the head man. So he said he's going to go to the front line himself, and that actually caused him being the main, like everybody blaming him for what's happening with the military, like disaster and people dying, like more killings happening after he joined the front line, basically. And political failures. The Tsar Nicholas had a chance to actually come to a new government, constitutional monarchy, but he turned the opportunity down, and that was really not a good idea. The Duma advised him, but he ignored their opinions and just went with his head, which really wasn't a good idea. And the second one, in 1916 and 1917, earlier results caused the consequences. His popularity in the beginning of 1914 was up, but his popularity throttled to maybe 5% estimating as a guess. Threats from the civilians. One of the examples are International Women's Day. International Women's Day is supposed to be celebrating women, obviously, but they celebrate by having a revolt and a riot, and they basically revolted against the Tsar Nicholas because they had no food. The living conditions were really unlivable, obviously. They're cold with the winter coming in, and tough weather, no food, and their jobs are not working any better. So International Women's Day, they went later in the evening, they went to the men and the factories and asked if they could revolt with them, and they led a march in Petrograd. In February 1917, there was a revolution, obviously. The February Revolution was when all the civilians came out, and in International Women's Day had another revolt, but that actually caused deadlier consequences, which basically resulted in many civilians dying, and army people fighting against their own people. And after Tsar Nicholas had up to the last straw, he thought the February, earlier there were many strikes, but he just thought that's a minor threat when it was a huge threat. So he eventually being exiled, and the Duma, everybody looked to the Duma for advice, since their Tsar abandoned them, and the Duma developed the provisional government.